Imagine this. On the night of June 25, 1975, the largest democracy in the world was essentially put in a cage. Just like that. Civil liberties vanished, political rivals were thrown in jail, and the press was muzzled. For 21 straight months, India wasn't run by its people, but by decree. This is the story of the emergency, probably one of the most defining and controversial moments in modern Indian history.
Just a few days after the emergency was declared, this mock obituary shows up in one of India's biggest newspapers. Can you believe that? It was this incredible act of defiance right before the Iron Curtain of censorship came crashing down. And it just perfectly captured the shock, that sense of profound loss that people were feeling all across the country. So how on earth did it get to this point? How did a democracy that was so full of life suddenly end up on life support?
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the mood in the country right before the emergency, when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was at the absolute peak of her powers, but a huge storm was brewing. Then we'll get into the court case that lit the fuse. After that, we'll explore the harsh reality of the emergency itself, including some of its most brutal programs. And finally, we'll see how it all came to a head in a massive, dramatic election.
To really get the emergency, you have to understand the kind of power that Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had in the early 70s. She had just won a massive election in 1971 and then led the country to a huge military victory over Pakistan. Her authority felt almost unbreakable.
What's so fascinating here is the contrast. On one side, you've got Indira Gandhi, so powerful that people called her the Empress of India. Even her political opponents were calling her Durga, the powerful Hindu goddess. But on the other side, the country was just simmering. You had massive student protests against corruption popping up in states like Gujarat and Bihar. A really respected older leader, Jayaprakash Narayan, or JP, took all that anger and channeled it into a call for a total revolution. And on top of all that, a nationwide railway strike brought the entire country to a standstill. It was a perfect storm of political and economic chaos.
So, all this tension was ready to explode. But the final spark, it didn't come from a protest on the streets. It came from a courtroom. A legal challenge against Indira Gandhi herself would kick off a chain reaction that completely changed the course of Indian democracy.
On June 12, 1975, the Allahabad High Court dropped a political earthquake. It found the sitting prime minister, guilty of using government resources improperly during her election campaign. And the ruling was severe. The court didn't just cancel her election, it banned her from politics for 6 whole years. See, this wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was a direct shot at her entire political career.
And this just shows you how fast everything fell apart. We're talking less than 2 weeks to go from a court ruling to a full-blown constitutional crisis. So after the verdict, Gandhi appealed to the Supreme Court, but they only gave her a partial win. Sure, she could stay on as PM, but she couldn't vote in parliament. The opposition saw this as a sign of weakness, and JP Nayan called for massive nationwide protests to force her to resign. And that very same night, on her recommendation, the President of India declared a state of emergency, blaming internal disturbances.
The declaration came out of nowhere, and the crackdown was just as fast. Literally overnight, the basic character of India changed. The government immediately started to dismantle any and all opposition to grab absolute power.
Just look at this number for a second. Over 110,000 people arrested and locked up without a trial. These weren't just a few big-name politicians. This was a massive, sweeping campaign to silence anyone who might be a threat, from top opposition leaders to student activists to union bosses. They say the first casualty of war is the truth. Well, the first casualty of the emergency was the free press. On that very first night, the government cut the power to major newspaper headquarters in Delhi, so they couldn't print the news about the arrests. What followed was hardcore censorship. And in this amazing act of silent protest, some papers, like the Indian Express, just published blank pages where their main articles should have been. It was such a powerful message. The voice of democracy had been silenced.
So beyond the arrests and the censorship, the actual legal foundation of democracy was taken apart piece by piece. Fundamental rights, the very soul of the Constitution, were suspended. That meant citizens couldn't even go to court to challenge their own imprisonment. Elections? Canceled, indefinitely. The parliament, which was full of her supporters, was then used to pass radical new laws, like the infamous 42nd Amendment, which basically handed all the power to the prime minister and gutted the courts. In effect, she could now rule by decree.
But the emergency wasn't just about politics. It also unleashed these really aggressive social programs, mostly pushed by the prime minister's son, Sanjay Gandhi. And the human cost? Well, it was devastating. this number is it's hard to even comprehend. As part of this obsessive drive to control India's population, 8.3 million people were sterilized in a single year. Government workers were given quotas, which created this insane pressure to hit their targets by any means necessary. And while it was officially voluntary, it became a campaign of widespread coercion and force, a campaign of fear.
And behind that staggering statistic are countless personal tragedies. Stories like this one about Hawa Singh, a young man, a widower, just pulled off a bus against his will, sterilized, and he ended up dying from an infection. Men were literally rounded up at bus stations and their jobs. For the poor and the powerless, there was no way to say no. It became this terrifying symbol of the state reaching into the most private part of a person's life.
And at the exact same time, there was this massive urban beautification plan, especially in Delhi. This table just lays out the shocking speed of it. In the 2.5 years before the emergency, about 1,800 buildings were torn down. During the 21 months of the emergency, that number jumped over 150,000. Whole neighborhoods, entire slum colonies were just bulldozed, often with no warning, leaving hundreds of thousands of people homeless.
After 21 long months of this, in January 1977, Indira Gandhi did something nobody expected. She called for general elections. It was a huge gamble. She clearly believed the people would thank her for this era of discipline. The opposition, with its leaders just getting out of jail, had a very different idea.
The opposition, which was really just a mashup of different parties that came together under one banner, the Janata Party, they framed the election in the simplest, most powerful terms possible. The choice, they said, wasn't about this policy versus that policy. The choice was simple: democracy or dictatorship. The whole thing became a referendum on the last 21 months of fear and control.
And the people's verdict was absolutely clear. The Janata Party alliance won in a landslide, grabbing 345 seats. The Congress Party was crushed, down to just 154. And in the biggest political shock of all, both Indira Gandhi and her son Sanjay lost their own elections. For the first time since India's independence, the Congress Party was voted out of power.
So what do we make of the emergency today? Well, its legacy is complicated. It's this bone-chilling reminder of just how fragile democracy can be, how easily it can be taken away, not by an invader, but from the inside. But at the same time, that 1977 election result is this powerful story about how resilient those same democratic ideas are. Because in the end, when the people finally got their chance to speak, they chose freedom. And that leaves all of us with a really important question, one that every generation has to answer for itself. What is the price of liberty, and what are we willing to do to protect it?